This morning we are going to be landing in Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. So if you have your Bibles, open your Bibles to that text in Luke chapter 18. And we are going to be focused in on this parable this morning that Jesus taught. Ties very well in with our themes this week on the whole issue of prayer. We're going to continue in this theme of prayer as we look at the whole issue of what it means to be a disciple, because if you are a disciple of Christ, if you're a follower of Jesus, one of the aspirations that all of us should really have is a continuation, an improvement plan on our prayer life. And so that's what we're going to be focusing in on this morning. In fact, we are going to focus a lot on the whole issue of adoration this morning. We're going to dig deeper into this whole issue of adoration. So this whole thing launches. In fact, I had intended to go a little bit deeper than just adoration because I was going to move into a confession also, but nevertheless, we are going to focus our energy this morning on the whole issue of living or pursuing a right fellowship with God. And so this morning is just a little bit of background on this, is the whole issue that, many people, have difficulty in terms of mastering the prayer life. It is no doubt the most difficult of the spiritual disciplines. And, most people, as we were describing last week, that most people have a difficulty with either a prayer strategy and putting together how that looks and what that looks like. And then the other real big challenge is the whole issue of consistency in their prayer life. And so most people have this hit or miss approach when it comes to prayer. And, whenever I look back over the course of my lifetime, prayer can be a very hit or miss proposition. And oftentimes it can drift into this whole idea of just, approaching God with a genie mindset or a Santa Claus approach or strategy. And that is really woefully inadequate. Believers, often pray out of obligation also, where they don't really have this heartfelt longing, this desire to say, I really want to pray and I really want to have this time with God alone. And so it's really important that we cultivate that mindset to not pray out of obligation, but really a sense of longing to really have some prayer time alone with God, genuine communication and fellowship with Him. And so few people, and as we were talking about last week, few people are really trained or equipped on the basics of prayer ministry. So prayer is a vital part of discipleship training. And one of the things that I do whenever I disciple people one-on-one, and I do that with them, I really take a serious amount of time focusing on the whole issue of prayer and what that looks like. So we need to develop a strategic prayer plan. And so as I was talking about this last week, I had talked about three different helpful hints, and that is to remove yourself from distractions and interruptions. That's really a really important part, where you resist temptation for busyness or other outside distractions. Sometimes people like to go into nature and to just kind of go out there, but, I'm so kind of like easily distracted. If I go to the woods, I'll be the first one to see the squirrels and start thinking about the squirrels, instead of focusing my attention on God. So just put yourself in a position where you do not have places where there are distractions or interruptions. And then the second major tip that I had outlined last week was that to have a game plan or strategy for your prayer time. And I suggested that you keep a prayer journal of some kind. It's helpful for me. I carry a prayer journal around that, at least I have a running tally, so to speak, of things that I need to pray for throughout the week. It's very helpful for me to remember that, to have a memory jogger in terms of who and what I want to pray about for specific people. And then third today, I wanted to add another helpful tip was that check your heart attitude in light of who God is. And adoration is required for approaching God in prayer. We touched on that a little bit last week, but we're going to go into this in far greater detail this morning. You need to verbalize his supremacy because it sets the stage for your prayer life. And so humility before God demonstrates that we are honest with ourselves first, right? We're honest with ourselves in terms of who we really are, in terms of our being, and about our very limited capacities as sinful creatures. Being honest, being humble, right? And being honest are critical for proper prayer life in light of who we are praying to in terms of God. Now, I came up with this graphic to help you understand this, and I put this on the back of your handout this morning. AI can be used for a lot of cool things, and it can be very destructive. But what I did was I gave AI the ideas for this graphic, and if you follow this graphic, you will see how ACTS can play a really helpful part in your prayer life. So A is for adoration, C is for confession. So adoration, what we're going to focus on this morning, is praising God for who he is. And launching in that direction with respect to prayer is so critical because it has continuing effects, right, about the rest of your prayer time. So then getting aligned right is so important with respect to who God is. And then what that does is it instantly puts you in a mindset of, okay, so who am I in relationship to an eternal God, right? And instantly you should be humbled when you recognize who God is, right? You should instantly be humbled and gracious and thankful for what he's done. So that drives you to confession. And confession is basically agreeing with God about your personal sin. And then that drives us to the idea of being thankful, right? That we're thankful for the fact that because of Christ and what he's done, my sins have been forgiven, and I'm thankful for that, right? And then there's a lot of other things that cascade from that whole thing, right, about being thankful for your salvation. You can be thankful for so many other things in life, our personal needs, how God provides for us, right? Thankful for various things in life. There's just endless lists of things that we can be thankful for. And then the final thing is supplication. And that's just being very transparent before God and appealing to God for divine intervention in life issues. You see, we're instructed, and we're going to get to this further on in this series, this mini-series within the discipleship, the whole issue on prayer, is that we are instructed to bring our most innermost desires to God because he wants to hear from us. So this is a simple plan. It's a powerful connection, and it can be life transformative. Now, I want to read to you a text message that I got this morning, all right, about this whole thing. And we had some visitors last week at our service. Well, they're really not visitors. They're here on a semi-frequent basis. It's Dave's son-in-law. His name is Brandon. And Gail sent this to me this morning, and it was very humbling. And this is what was said. This is from Brandon, their son-in-law, from his heart, from hearing your message this past Sunday. That was last week. He says, if either of you have a chance to talk with Keith this morning, could you please let him know that the message he gave last week was exactly what our family needed to hear. I felt extremely challenged with my personal prayer life and worked on that this week. It impacted me so much that I decided to use the points of his message to continue my teaching in my Wednesday night youth group last week, and I will probably use it for the next 2 weeks. 2 kids came up to me after class to talk more about how to pray. What a huge blessing. And his wife, Anna, which is Dave and Gil's daughter, says, Anna and I have great conversation this week about prayer in our life, revolving around that message. On Thursday night, we were sitting at the kitchen island, and Nate, their son, I don't know how old Nate is. Was he probably like 17 or something like that? But nevertheless, Nate said to Anna and I, I was sitting praying yesterday, and I was trying to pray the way Pastor Keith was explaining. And when I really started talking to God about how amazing he is, it blew me away. It's almost unbelievable to think about how big and powerful he is, and then realize that he knows me and listens to me. It was really cool. And those are Nate's words. And then Brandon goes on to say, as a dad, I don't know that you could ask for much more than to know your kid is working on his relationship with Jesus. Isn't that a great testimony about impacting on prayer can be? Use Acts. And so as we continue in this whole study this morning, we're going to really focus in on this whole case study that Jesus gives to us about prayer. And so as we open up in Luke 18 and we begin, we can see here in verse 9 where it says, and he also told a parable. So this is a parable, and Jesus often used parables as illustrations or it can be fictitious, and it might be here, but it also might have some truth to it. But nevertheless, he says this parable to who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. So Jesus is kind of using this parable to be a teaching mechanism for those who had pride issues. So then he goes on to say, he says in verse 10, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and another a tax collector. All right? And so verse 11 says, and the Pharisee stood up and was praying this to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I pray and I pay tithes of all that I get. All right, so let's unpackage this. So this is a case study on prayer. And so some background is necessary here. So both men from the extremes of Jewish society are in this picture. One is a Pharisee, but they both go to the temple to pray. Now, this was very common for Jewish people to do this. So one is a Pharisee, and he's a religious leader. And so Pharisees are religious leaders who generally they were generally thought of as being, there were positive perspectives of them. Now, sometimes they were viewed with some contempt, but nevertheless, but generally they were thought of as positively. They focused on reading the Torah and supporting literature that dictated their tendencies towards purity and legalism. So they tended to be very conservative of the Jewish tradition. The Sadducees on the other side are more liberal on their perspectives. But the Pharisees were the more hardliners in terms of their conservative views on scriptures and so forth. But nevertheless, they rejected Jesus, so his claims and the gospel message. And so the second man is a tax collector. Now, tax collectors, these were Jewish men. And they collected taxes for the Roman government from the Jews. So their compensation, so automatically they're thrown into this category. They're almost like a traitor to the nation. And they, because they're collecting taxes from Jewish people to provide that revenue to the Roman government, who were considered to be invaders of the nation of Israel. And so what compounded the problem is that not only are they traitors, but they also used manipulative tactics for their own personal compensation. So their compensation was based on a percentage of the tax revenue that they charged. And so they often resorted to extortion, to bribes, or overcharge. Now, not that any kind of people from the government would do that today, but they wouldn't lie to you either, by the way, right? So much for this week. But nevertheless, they resorted to these overcharges, and so the revenue from taxes was taken from the Jewish people and from the people who had earned that income, and that income was sent to what the Roman officials, their arch enemies, and their oppressors, and I might add brutal oppressors, all right? They did not do away with the police, let's just say that, right? It was a brutal dictatorship, and they exercised that authority with great zeal. So they were despised and rejected members of the Jewish society, and they were considered traitors to the Jewish people. So now you have these two extremes. On one side of the coin, you have these highly respected, to certain levels, of Jewish leaders of the religious order, and they were part of the society. And so then you have the tax collectors, the despised, basically thought of as thieves, right? Who were traitors to the nation, and extortioners on the income side. So you have these two extremes of people that Jesus is describing. So let's look at and unpackage the Pharisees' heart attitude. The Pharisees' heart attitude. So when we get to this place, the temple was a customary place of prayer, and standing was a normal posture in prayer at this time. And so we see here where this Pharisee in verse 11 is, he's the two men went up to pray, verse 10, and one a Pharisee and one tax collector. And so he focuses in on the Pharisee first. And so the Pharisee stood and was praying to himself. Now notice what he says there. So it's not the issue that he's standing to pray. Some people make a big deal about that, but no, in the custom of that era, it was common for people to stand and pray. In fact, we see where the tax collector is also standing as he prays as well. But nevertheless, we see him, and he appears to be standing, but that's not the central issue. And so this is probably in the inner court of the temple, and he's trying to be seen by others. That's the main idea of this. He's standing in a prominent location where others can see him. And so he's trying to kind of like show off a little bit about how righteous and how holy he really is. And in the midst of this kind of like odd way of thinking of prayer, right? He's trying to grab attention for himself while he's praying to God. But Jesus notes that the Pharisee prayed to himself. Now that is a difficult text, because the preposition there is that when it says that he was praying to himself, it could be also translated he was praying about himself. So it depends on the translation there of how they want to translate that, but nevertheless, he could be praying silently, or he could be praying like about how great I am. You see, that's what the idea here is. That so it's debatable about whether it was to himself, in silence, so to speak, or whether he was praying about himself. So he states that he is thankful to God, right? I am thankful to God, but he's thanking God that he is not like others. You see this? So he's thankful to God not because of God is so great and so wonderful and so forth. No, but he's thankful that he's looking around while he's praying, and he's saying, well, I'm glad I'm not like that guy, and I'm glad I'm not like that guy. You see, his focus was not really on God. It was on trying to show how off himself in terms of how great he was in comparison to other people who were considerably different than what he was. And they were obviously what he thought of as being greater sinners. So his prayer is all about him. And so we notice here it continues it even gets worse, right? So he compares himself to others who were obvious sinners, and this gives him a sense of instant superiority. So he uses the wrong benchmark here in terms of his prayer life. He focuses on the swindlers, the unjust, the adulterers, and the tax collector. He said, I'm so glad I'm not like this. I'm so thankful that I'm not like them. Almost looking at them with contempt instead of compassion or love, right? And recognizing that he himself has sinful issues within himself But see, no, so is he really genuinely thankful, or is he just trying to pump up his own tires, so to speak? You see what I'm saying? I just don't think he's really truly grateful, but he's trying to find a sense where he is superior compared to others. And so notice the personal pronouns in this section in verses 11 and 12, when it's described about this Pharisee in 11 and 12. It says here, notice the personal pronouns. The Pharisee stood up and was praying to himself. See the personal pronoun there? God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes about all that I get. See all the personal pronouns there? Who's it about? Who's this prayer about? It's about himself. It's all about me. You see, this is very troubling when we think about prayer. A Pharisee of all people, right, going to the temple and focusing entirely on himself. You see, he verbalized his superiority compared to others, and he had a better pedigree, right, of inward merit and life position. And he affirms his piety, and he affirms as to how good he is in terms of what he does, right? What he does in terms of his fasting and tithing. Now, with just a little bit of background here, I picked this up from Tom Constable, and he says that Pharisees fasted twice a week on Thursdays and Mondays. Those were the normal days that Pharisees fasted during the weeks between Passover and Pentecost, and between the Feast of the Tabernacles and the Feast of Dedication. But some even fasted every single Thursday and Monday all year long. They believed that on Thursday Moses had gone up from the Mount Sinai, and that on Monday he had come down. So the focus was entirely on this reverence for Moses, and after receiving the law the second time. So the Pharisees also scrupulously about tithing. And so the whole idea here is that what he's following these regulations. You see, is it about a relationship with God, or is this all about what? Checking the box. You see what I'm saying? It became a regulated habit for him as opposed to going before a holy and righteous God. You see, the Pharisee is self-deceived, self-consumed, and prideful. He was exalting himself. So now we move on to this next person. It is the tax collector and his heart attitude. And so in contrast, Jesus describes the tax collector, and we see here he is also standing but a distance away in verse 13. Now let's pick up with the tax collector in verse 13. And he says, but the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I tell you this, and so let's just stop there in verse 13. It gives us just a one-verse picture of this tax collector. So he's not seeking personal accolades or recognition, right? So even his position as to where he is in the temple, he is some distance away. And so evidently his head is bowed and is beating his chest, both signs of humility and contrition. And he knows and admits that he is unworthy. See, the tax collector, he recognizes that he is a sinner and he is unworthy. You see, in prayer, he appeals to God for mercy. And he confesses that his ownership of the fact, and takes ownership of the fact that he is an unworthy sinner. You see, it's not about himself, but it's all about God and his mercy. And so it's obvious that the tax collector recognizes the supremacy of God and his glory. And so we see here also that he did not use other men as his benchmark, but he used God as his benchmark in terms of who he compared himself to. You see, whenever you think about who God is and how holy and righteous he is, and when you compare that to yourself, you recognize, you see, that's what drives us to what? Confession. And so we see here also that knowing his sinful condition in light of the glory of God causes him to have a deep sense of humility. His location, his posture, even his head position when he's praying tell us that he is honest with himself, because his whole attitude and his mindset was that what? I am unworthy. You see, in addition to his head bowed and his beating of his chest, is that these are pictures of his humility. He is obviously a person. He is transparent about his personal sin before God and his appeal to God for mercy. He knows that he is unrighteous before a holy and righteous God. You see, it was all about God. So now let's look at this whole issue of humility and honesty are paramount. And so when we think about this, when we look into verse 14, Jesus moves on in the text. He says, and I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. So Jesus adds his teaching at the end of this parable to kind of put a capstone on this whole little vignette. This kind of like super short story, right? About these two men who approach God in prayer at the temple. And so Jesus proclaims that the tax collector went home justified, and he was honest about his condition and showed humility about his sinful plight, seeking God's mercy. But the Pharisee, on the other hand, was not justified. He did not have a heart attitude of humility. In fact, he was quite prideful. The Pharisee was quite prideful. And therefore, he was really, truly dishonest about who he really is. And he lied to him. He lied not only to God, right? But he also, first off, he lied to himself, and then he lied to God about his true state. I don't care who you are in terms of this life. I don't care if you're where you are in terms of ministry or pastoral ministry or any place of teaching, elders. You need to be humble and you need to recognize yourself before a holy, righteous God. Do not lie to yourself about your real, true state. And it's very easy to fall into that snare. You see, for everyone, Jesus says here in verse 14, he says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. And so these are very gripping and very, so this passage talks about, and so we have to remember when we look at this passage, this is written before Jesus even died on a cross. And so the whole idea was that what people, the Pharisee at least thought that it's what about I do, not about God's grace and his mercy. But the application here about prayer is that this, and so the Pharisee and the tax collector, and I had this graphic, hopefully you can see it pretty good up there, but that's not too bad. But notice that there's two different prayers. There's two different hearts, and there's two different outcomes. You see this? And what we see here is that his prayer was, what God, I thank you that I'm not like other people who are robbers, evildoers, adulterers. Even this tax collector, I tithe twice a week, and I give a tenth to all that I get. Whereas the simple prayer of the tax collector was, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. You see, the heart of the Pharisee was focused on himself. He compares himself to others, and he trusts in his own righteousness. I might add, he does really, whenever you look at it, he really does not have a lot of righteousness whatsoever, does he? He might have piety, but he doesn't truly have righteousness. You see, he is proud and he is self-consumed and self-satisfied, whereas the heart of the tax collector was such that he focused on God, he acknowledged his own sin, and he relies on God's mercy and his grace, and he was humble, and I would add honest and repentant. You see, the key lessons from this storyline are that God opposes the pride, and he rewards the humble. And it's not about works, it's about God's mercy and his grace. So when we think about this whole prayer issue, what the whole issue and mindset of prayer when we come before God should be such that we focus in on God first. So the question I have for you this morning is this, is that how does a believer demonstrate true humility before God in terms of their prayer life? See, it's a haunting thing for me that whenever I think about today in our culture, and I look at about the whole, big plane of Christianity today, it's very troubling to me because I don't see a lot of humility. I see a lot of fanfare and a lot of big programs, very little about truly worshiping God. You see, where we need to go and where we need to move in terms of true humility before God is that the person needs to acknowledge the creator-creature distinction and is honest and humble before God. You see, I think this is critical. And I think if we do not grasp or understand the creator-creature distinction first and foremost, we will have a spin out of control perspective of everything when it comes to our relationship with God and especially our prayer life before him. Because if you don't understand the creator-creature distinction, right, you will not be honest and you will not be humble before God. And so adoration is the beginning of worship, okay? Adoration is the beginning of worship. And I would say, and I might add, that it's the beginning of true and genuine prayer life. So when we think about this, and I talked with you about this last week, is that there are incommunicable attributes and there are attributes that are communicable. And so omniscient, right? That's God is all-knowing. Omnipresent, he is everywhere at the same time. He not only knows it, but he's present everywhere. He knows everything. And he's omnipotent. He is all-powerful. So when you think about your prayer life, you think about adoration, right? These are where the directions that you need to go. Because you see, folks, this is a part of the creator-creature distinction. You see this? He is all-knowing. You are not. See this? He is present everywhere. You are not. He is all-powerful. You are not. I don't care what you're the CEO of or the President of the United States, right? He is eternal. He never had a beginning. He never had an end. He's infinite. There's no measuring him. He has a deity. A deity is basically this idea that he is self-existent. He does not need anything else to exist. He doesn't need food. He doesn't need water. He doesn't need anything or anybody. He's immutable. His character never changes. And he is supremely sovereign. You see, when we start our prayer life off, beginning with adoration and focus in on some of these incommunicable attributes, it will revolutionize your entire prayer life. And then we move on to He is the creator. You can be a creator in one respect, but you can't be a creator out of ex nihilo. That means out of nothing. Everything you create, you need to have something that you're building something with, right? But God creates everything out of what? Nothing. And so the communicable attributes are that He is love. He is loving. Aren't you glad for God's love? He is just. He is wise. He is faithful. He is good. He demonstrates goodness to us. He demonstrates mercy to us. He's grace-giving. And He is kind. You see, all of these attributes can really help you as you launch into your prayer life. Just to say, Lord, I want to come before you this morning and say how wonderful it is to know a God that is the creator of the universe, who created everything out of nothing. And you are the God who is omniscient. You know everything. You see everything. You have power over everything. You see, starting your prayer life off with that kind of adoration to God is critical. So God is worthy of our adoration, and it humbles the heart, the soul, and the mind of people. So when we look at Revelation chapter 4, verse 11, it says, and this is a great verse to use as an adoration thing, worthy are you, O Lord our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were created. You see, that's the heart of adoration. You see, and we live in a culture that's completely different to that. We live in a culture and society that says everything, that we are so important and we are so great. You know, it's a Pharisaic mindset from the very get-go. You see, an anthropocentric framework is antithetical to the biblical framework. The believer is required to humble themselves in light of God, who is compared with natural limitations and a sinful state. You see, worship is greater than arrogance. Prayer is an act of true worship. Psalm 8, we talked about this last week also. Psalm 8 is another picture of adoration, where it says, and David said this in Psalm 8, Lord, O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, who has displayed your splendor above the heavens. When you look out into creation and you look at even a place where there's all kinds of grown-up weeds and everything, I see God's glory in that weed patch. He is to be worshiped. And we are to adore Him for who He is. So what are some application points for this morning? Well, first off, yes, believers can have an improper heart attitude when it comes to personal prayer. God is not Santa Claus, a genie, or a vending machine. So often our prayer requests hop over adoration, confession, even thanksgiving, and they rocket right straight to the prayer requests. How out of balance is that? In my view, it's very tragic. And I might add, as an 1A, right? I personally believe, this is just Keith Thomas, I personally believe that some of the challenges that we face in Christendom today is that we rely way too much on gizmos and gadgets than really being about prayer before a holy God. Look, God can work far greater than any gizmo or a human gadget that we can devise. Amen? 2, believers can be lured into a false form of pride when they address God as their buddy, their companion, or their friend. Now, I know there's a great song that says, "What a friend we have in Jesus," right? However, when you begin to reduce God to your buddy, your companion, or your friend, or even some music today, it's almost like it's your mate, to me is despicable. But nevertheless, yes, God does love you. And yes, he sent his son to die on the cross for you, but there's a huge distinction between God and yourself. Don't forget that he is a holy, righteous God who is far above you. And because of his love for us, right? He is like a friend, but he is not a buddy or a companion. He is a holy God. 3rd, and I'm going to challenge you with this week. Deploy ACTS in your everyday prayer life this week. As you pray, okay, use the flyer on the back of your handout this morning to act as a guide for ACTS this week. Take time to just take some time to deploy ACTS this week in your everyday prayer life. 4th, express adoration to God by acknowledging at least one divine attribute during your prayer time this week. When you recognize how great and wonderful, and you acknowledge how great and wonderful God is, it will revolutionize your prayer life. Worship him for who he is. And finally, adoration in one's prayer life is critical to express proper honesty and humility before God. You see, even from today's text, we see where the whole issue of being honest with ourselves and honest with God drives us to being humble before a righteous, holy, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent God in life. And what's so amazing is that his love for us sent Christ to the cross so that we would have a relationship with the eternal God. How much do we have to be thankful for? So this week, go and adore God in your prayer life and deploy ACTS in your everyday prayer life. Let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, we truly acknowledge who you are in terms of the fact that you are a God that is far beyond our capacity to understand or even comprehend. Even the words that we use fall short of your magnificence. They just capture a small portion of your wonder and your glory. But Lord, you want people who are humble before you so that you can empower us to be used by you and empowered by you in everyday life circumstances to live for you. Lord, enable us to understand and to grasp and also apply what your word has for us this morning. May we go from this place encouraged, empowered, and Lord, committed to being your agent in this fallen world. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.